Martha Hayes stood in the doorway of the ranch house, her worn carpet bag clutched tightly in trembling hands. The harsh Montana winter was fast approaching, and with it came a sense of dread that Martha could no longer hide. Her face was streaked with tears, eyes swollen from sleepless nights. "Let me go, Mr. Callahan," she pleaded, voice breaking. "I'm nothing but a burden to you now." Ethan Callahan, the stoic cowboy who had employed her for 3 years, watched her quietly from the doorway. His heart ached as he saw the desperation in her eyes. He'd seen the signs for weeks, her shaking hands, the long pauses as she tried to focus on the tasks in front of her, but he hadn't been able to bring himself to ask what was wrong. He had always kept a distance, never allowing his feelings to show, and now that it seemed she wanted to leave, he felt something inside him break. Martha's hands shook as she held the bag, too heavy with shame to look him in the eye. "Please," she whispered, stepping back toward the door. "I'm useless now. I can't even do what I came here to do. If I can't cook, what good am I? You don't need me anymore." The words hit Ethan like a punch in the gut. He had always seen Martha as a hardworking, dependable woman, but lately, things had changed. Her cooking had become a series of mistakes. Burnt bread, dropped dishes, even the simplest tasks left unfinished. She had been hiding it, covering her errors, afraid of losing her position. Inside, Martha's mind was spiraling. She had no family to fall back on, no savings, no one to turn to if she left the ranch. She couldn't imagine a life alone in a small town, a life of poverty and fear. "I can't stay here like this," she thought to herself, tears burning down her cheeks. "If I can't work, I have no place in the world." The thought of being a burden to Ethan, a man who had already lost so much, filled her with shame. But what else could she do? Eleanor, the older housekeeper, noticed the change in Martha. It was hard to miss. She'd watched Martha struggle quietly for weeks, covering up the physical signs of her decline. But even Eleanor couldn't hide the concern in her voice when she said, "Martha, this is the third dish this week you've ruined. Are you feeling all right?" Martha had smiled weakly, trying to brush off the comment, but inside, panic swelled. "I can't cook anymore. I can't earn my keep. What if they fire me? I'll have nowhere to go, no way to survive." The idea of leaving the ranch and facing the cold, judgmental world outside terrified her. She had no one to rely on. Ethan had been kind to her, but she couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. She had to go. That night, she packed her bag in silence, crying quietly into the pillow, not wanting anyone to hear. As she reached for the door, she saw Ethan sitting outside on the porch, his back hunched, his hands clasped tightly together. His posture spoke of exhaustion, of a man who had seen too much loss in his life to hold on to much hope. But Martha couldn't stay. She had to leave before he decided she wasn't worth the trouble. She couldn't let him pity her. When a morning light broke over the ranch, Martha stood at the door, ready to leave. Eleanor tried to stop her, tears in her eyes. "You don't have to go, dear. You've been more than enough here." But Martha could barely meet her gaze. "I can't stay where I'm no good. I won't be Charity," she said, voice quivering. It was then that Ethan appeared from the barn, his boots crunching in the snow as he crossed the yard toward her. His eyes were cold, unreadable, but there was something in his stance that made her heart race. He wasn't going to let her leave. "Where do you think you're going?" he asked, his voice low, strong, and filled with something she couldn't quite name. Martha looked at him, trying to avoid his eyes, trying to hold on to the last bit of dignity she had. "I told you, I'm leaving before you fire me," she said, almost pleading. Ethan's jaw tightened. Without a word, he strode across the yard, his long strides making the snow crunch underfoot. When he reached her, he took the carpet bag from her hands, tossing it aside with a single motion. "You're not going anywhere, Martha. Not now. Not ever." His words hit her like a lightning bolt, shattering the walls she had spent so long building around her heart. Martha stood frozen, staring at him in disbelief. "You don't understand," she said, her voice cracking with emotion. I'm a burden. Useless. Ethan didn't flinch. His voice softened, but it was firm. You're not a burden, he said, his eyes locking onto hers. You're everything I've been too afraid to admit I need. Martha blinked, struggling to understand what he was saying. She had always been the one to take care of others, to provide, to work. She had never known what it meant to be needed. What? She whispered, her heart pounding in her chest. Ethan stepped closer, his hand gently resting on her arm. I'm asking you to stay, he said, voice thick with emotion. Not as my cook, as my wife. If you'll have me. Martha stood there, stunned, her mind racing. Was he offering her pity? Or was there something more? She opened her mouth to protest, but the words caught in her throat. She had no idea what to say, how to respond. All she knew was that, for the first time in years, someone had seen her for who she truly was, and they hadn't turned away. But Martha wasn't ready to believe in love. Not yet. The fear that had consumed her for years, of being weak, of being a burden, had taken root so deeply inside her that she wasn't sure how to let it go. I can't accept your pity, she whispered, shaking her head. Ethan's eyes darkened with frustration, but there was no anger in his gaze. This isn't pity, Martha, he said, his voice steady and certain. This is love, and I'm not asking you to be perfect. I'm asking you to be with me, as you are. Her heart thudded in her chest, but she still couldn't speak. Ethan's love was overwhelming, like a force she couldn't fight. But the fear of what she couldn't control, her condition, her future, was too much. I need time to think, she said, the words barely escaping her lips. Ethan nodded, his expression softening. Take all the time you need, he said, but I won't let you leave. Not without knowing how I feel. Martha glanced at him one last time, her heart torn between fear and hope. As she turned away, she didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. Ethan Callahan had just changed everything. The sun was just beginning to rise when Martha stood in the doorway, carpet bag packed and ready to leave. She hadn't slept, her mind racing with fear and uncertainty, but she knew she had to go. Eleanor, standing beside her, was trying to convince her to stay. But Martha's resolve was firm. I can't stay where I'm no good, she said quietly, her voice filled with sorrow. I won't be Charity. As she stepped toward the yard, her eyes caught sight of Ethan, emerging from a barn, his expression unreadable. The moment their gazes met, a quiet tension hung in the air. Where do you think you're going? Ethan's voice was calm, yet there was a firmness that made her freeze in place. She couldn't look him in the eye, guilt and shame flooding her chest. I told you, I'm leaving before you fire me, she whispered, but Ethan didn't let her move. Without a word, he walked toward her, taking the carpet bag from her trembling hands and tossing it aside. You're not going anywhere, Martha. Not now. Not ever. His declaration hit her like a wave, drowning her in confusion. She opened her mouth to protest, but the words caught in her throat. Her heart raced as she tried to process what he was saying. You don't understand, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I'm a burden. Useless. Ethan didn't hesitate. You're not a burden, he said, stepping closer, his voice low but steady. You're everything I've been too afraid to admit I needed. Martha's breath caught in her throat. She stared at him, unsure of what he meant. What? She asked, her heart pounding with disbelief. Ethan met her gaze, his voice rough with emotion. I'm asking you to stay, he said, his words steady and full of intent. Not as my cook, as my wife. If you'll have me. The words hung in the air between them, and Martha stood frozen, unable to respond. It was the last thing she had expected to hear, and for a moment, she couldn't comprehend it. She was used to taking care of herself, to hiding her weaknesses, and now Ethan was offering her something she hadn't allowed herself to imagine. A future with him. A future that didn't depend on her ability to work, to earn her place. But the fear that had plagued her for years, the fear of being useless, of being dependent, was still there, deep within her. She shook her head, her voice shaky. "You don't understand," she said, her mind scrambling for a way to reject his offer without losing her dignity. "You're proposing out of pity. I won't accept that." Ethan's eyes softened, but his resolve was unwavering. "This isn't pity, Martha," he said quietly. "This is love. I'm not asking you to be perfect. I'm asking you to be with me, as you are." The sincerity in his words took her breath away. Her heart ached, torn between the fear of being vulnerable and the undeniable pull of his affection. "But what happens when I get worse?" she asked, her voice trembling. "When I can't see anymore, when I can't take care of myself?" Ethan reached out, taking her trembling hands in his. "Then we'll figure out together," he said, his voice steady, full of conviction. "You're not a burden, Martha. You're my partner, and that's all that matters." Martha felt a tear slip down her cheek, but this time it wasn't from shame. It was from something else, something she had been too afraid to feel. A sense of belonging, of being wanted, not for what she could do, but for who she was. "I don't know how to be loved without earning it," she whispered, her voice breaking. Ethan pulled her closer, his arms strong around her. "Then I'll teach you," he said gently. "And you'll teach me how to love without fear. We'll both be beginners." Martha's heart swelled with emotion, but she still couldn't bring herself to say the words. "I want to say yes," she said, voice soft but filled with uncertainty. "But I need time, just one day to think. Please." Ethan nodded, his expression filled with understanding, but also with something more. Relief. Hope. He had made his choice, and now he would give her the space to make hers. As Martha turned and stepped back inside, Eleanor was waiting, her eyes filled with knowing. "Let's talk, dear," she said, her voice gentle. "There are some things you need to understand about love." Martha nodded, her heart heavy with the weight of the decision before her. But for the first time in a long while, she felt a glimmer of hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, love wasn't something she had earned. And maybe, just maybe, she could learn to accept it. Martha sat in the kitchen, the weight of the decision still heavy on her heart. Eleanor had insisted on talking to her, sensing that Martha was struggling, unsure of how to accept the love that Ethan had offered her. "I've watched you two dance around each other for 3 years," Eleanor said, sitting across from her, her voice soft but knowing. "That man loves you, Martha. Real love. The kind that sees everything and chooses you anyway." Martha wiped at her tears, feeling both ashamed and comforted by the older woman's words. "But I don't know how to be loved without being useful," Martha whispered. "I've never learned." Eleanor's face softened as she leaned forward, her eyes filled with understanding. "My husband Frank, God rest him, had an accident 20 years ago. A wagon rolled over his legs," Eleanor began, her voice carrying the weight of her own long journey. "Left him unable to walk without crutches. In constant pain. I cared for him for 15 years until he passed." Martha looked up, surprised by the vulnerability Eleanor was showing. "Know what?" Eleanor continued, her voice steady and full of wisdom. "Never once did I feel burdened. Because love isn't a transaction, Martha. You don't trade usefulness for affection. You don't earn your place. You just are. And that's enough for the person who truly loves you." The words sank deep into Martha's heart. She had spent so many years trying to earn her worth through hard work, through usefulness, that she had forgotten the truth of what love really was. She had always feared being a burden, always worried that if she couldn't contribute in the way she had always known, she would lose the people she loved. But Eleanor's words, full of wisdom and lived experience, made her see that love didn't work that way. Love wasn't about what you could do. It was about who you were. It was about being seen, truly seen, and still being chosen. What scares you more, becoming dependent or accepting that you're worthy of unconditional love? Eleanor asked, her voice gentle yet firm, as if pushing Martha to confront the heart of her fear. Martha's breath hitched, the truth of Eleanor's question cutting straight to the core of her. She had always feared losing her independence, losing herself in her illness. "I watched my mother die in a county poorhouse," Martha said quietly, her voice trembling. "She had no one, nothing. I swore I'd never be helpless like that." Eleanor reached across the table, placing a hand on Martha's. "You're not your mother, dear. And Ethan isn't asking you to be helpless. He's asking you to be his. There's a difference." The words hung in the air, and Martha felt a weight lift from her chest. She had been so afraid of ending up like her mother, so afraid of becoming a burden, that she hadn't been able to see the love Ethan was offering her. It wasn't about her illness. It wasn't about what she could or couldn't do. It was about the person she was, and Ethan had loved her for that person, not for her ability to work, to cook, to serve. "Pride is a cold companion in old age," Eleanor continued, her voice warm with kindness. "But love? Love warms you through the longest winters." Martha's heart swelled, a mix of relief and gratitude filling her as she realized the truth in Eleanor's words. She had been so focused on what she was losing, her independence, her ability to work, that she hadn't stopped to see what she could gain. A partner, a home, a man who loved her despite her weaknesses, despite her illness. It was more than she had ever hoped for, and yet it was standing right in front of her. She didn't need to be perfect. She didn't need to be useful. She just needed to be herself. "I've been so focused on what I'm losing that I haven't seen what I could gain," she said softly, the realization dawning on her. Eleanor smiled, her eyes filled with pride. "Now you're thinking clearly." Later that afternoon, Martha found Ethan in the horse barn, brushing down his mare. He was pretending to be calm, but Martha could see the tension in his shoulders. He had been so certain, so unshaken in his feelings for her, but she hadn't been able to believe it. She had been too afraid to trust in the love he was offering. She stood there for a moment, watching him before calling his name softly. "Ethan!" His head snapped around, hope and fear warring in his face. "Have you decided?" he asked, his voice tight with anticipation. She stepped closer, her heart pounding. "I've been afraid my whole life," she began, her voice shaky with the weight of her confession. "My parents died when I was 12. I learned early that survival meant usefulness. Every position I've held, I've worked myself to exhaustion trying to be indispensable. Because if I was indispensable, I couldn't be discarded." She paused, taking a deep breath. "But you're not asking me to be indispensable. You're asking me to be loved." Ethan's face softened, and he stepped closer to her. "Martha," he said gently, his voice full of emotion, "I never wanted you to be indispensable. I wanted you to be the woman I loved. And I love you, all of you, trembling hands and all." A tear slipped down Martha's cheek as she met his gaze. She had spent so many years hiding behind her usefulness, behind her fear of being a burden. But now, in this moment, she could see the truth. She was worthy of love, just as she was. "I don't know how to do that," she whispered, her voice breaking. "How to be vulnerable. How to accept help without shame." Ethan's hand reached out, gently cupping her face. "Then we'll learn together," he said, his voice filled with certainty. "I don't know how to open my heart after Sarah. We'll both be beginners." Martha's heart swelled with emotion as she realized that Ethan wasn't asking her to be perfect, to be anything other than herself. He was offering her a life, full of love, full of acceptance, full of hope. "I'm scared," she said softly, her voice trembling. "But I'm more scared of walking away from this. From you." Ethan smiled, a small but sincere smile that filled her heart with warmth. "Then we'll take it one step at a time," he said. Together, Martha felt the weight of her fear lifting, replaced by something new, something she had never allowed herself to feel before. Hope, love, a future. "I'm ready," she whispered, her heart finally at peace. "I'm ready to be loved." Ethan's arms wrapped around her, pulling her close, and for the first time in years, Martha allowed herself to believe that love wasn't about what she could do or offer. It was about who she was. And that was enough. The days following their conversation in the barn were filled with a newfound sense of peace. But Martha knew that life, even when filled with love, would not be without its challenges. The wedding day arrived quietly, with simple elegance. Nothing extravagant, just the people who truly mattered. Ethan had kept everything small, and it felt right. Martha wore the cream-colored dress Eleanor had altered for her, and although she felt self-conscious, she couldn't help but smile. The dress, like everything else in her life now, wasn't perfect, but it was hers, and that was enough. Ethan stood beside her, in his best suit, the one he'd worn to Sarah's funeral, his hair neatly combed, his expression a mixture of joy and solemnity. They exchanged vows on the porch of the ranch house, the sun sinking low in the sky, casting a warm glow over the ceremony. The only witnesses were the ranch hands, Pete and his wife Hannah, and Eleanor, who was practically beaming. "Finally, you stubborn fools," she muttered, wiping a tear from her eye. Martha had always been a quiet woman, and the thought of standing in front of people had always made her nervous. But today, she felt a quiet strength in her chest. Ethan's hand, warm and steady in hers, anchored her, as she couldn't help but look at him with gratitude. She had feared this moment for so long, afraid of being too weak, too helpless, but now, here she was, married, loved, and accepted. The ceremony was brief, but the significance of it stayed with her for days to come. That night, Ethan carried her over the threshold into their shared home, the one they would build together. Martha was nervous, unsure of what the night would bring. She had been married before, but that was a lifetime ago, and it hadn't been built on love. But Ethan was gentle, patient, and reassuring, making her feel safe and cherished. "We have all the time in the world," he said, his voice full of tenderness. And in that moment, Martha realized that she wasn't being rushed, that this wasn't about perfection, but about connection. The days that followed their wedding felt like a whirlwind. Martha, who had always found purpose in work, struggled to adjust to her new role as a wife rather than a cook. She couldn't stop herself from trying to take charge of the kitchen, constantly stepping in to help even though Ethan had made it clear that she wasn't expected to do everything herself. "Martha," he said one evening, frustration creeping into his voice as she reached for a pot. "You're my wife. Stop serving me like I'm your employer." Martha froze, her hand still on the handle. "I don't know how else to be," she admitted, the words slipping from her before she could stop them. Ethan sighed, stepping closer, his hand gently resting on her shoulder. "I know," he said softly, "but you need to let me take care of you too. This isn't just about you taking care of me. We're partners now, not employer and servant." The words hit her hard, and for a moment, she felt a pang of guilt. She had spent her whole life trying to be useful, trying to earn her place. But now, in this new life with Ethan, she had to learn a new way of being. It was difficult, but with each day, she began to understand that love wasn't about what you could offer. It was about being there for each other, in the good and the bad. Meanwhile, her new role as the ranch's bookkeeper brought her a sense of purpose she hadn't anticipated. Even with her failing eyesight, Martha had an exceptional head for numbers, and it wasn't long before she was catching errors in the accounts, finding ways to save the ranch money. Ethan was incredibly proud of her, telling her that she had paid for herself 10 times over. Martha, who had once believed that her worth was tied to her ability to cook, now realized that her value came from within, her mind, her kindness, her capacity to love and be loved. But even as she grew into her new role, Martha's body continued to deteriorate. Some days, her hands shook so violently that she could barely hold a pen, and her vision grew worse by the day. It was on one of these days, a mere 2 weeks into their marriage, that Martha woke up and found herself unable to dress herself. Her hands trembled uncontrollably as she tried to button her blouse. her frustration mounting with every failed attempt. Tears filled her eyes, and she collapsed on the bed, sobbing. Ethan woke up to find her crying, her hands shaking as she tried to steady herself. He immediately rushed to her side, kneeling beside the bed. "What's wrong, Martha?" he asked, concern and tenderness in his voice. "I can't do it," she sobbed. "I can't even dress myself. I'm useless. I'm a burden." Ethan's heart broke for her, but there was no pity in his gaze, only love. "Martha," he said softly, taking her trembling hands in his. "You're not useless. You're having a hard day. That's all. And I'll help you with whatever you need. Just like I promised." The words were simple, but they meant everything to her. He didn't see her as a burden. He didn't see her as less than he had loved her before. He saw her as his partner, his equal, and that realization comforted her in a way she couldn't quite explain. Despite her fears, despite the shame she felt at needing help, Ethan never wavered. He was patient, steady, and always present. Yet, the hardest day of all came when Martha had to face the judgment of the outside world. They attended church together for the first time as a married couple, and it was there that Martha's worst fears were realized. As she walked into the small church on Ethan's arm, she could hear the whispers from the congregation. "Did you hear? He married the cook." And her being sickly, too, must have felt sorry for her. Poor man, saddled with an invalid wife. The comment stung, cutting into her already fragile self-esteem. She excused herself from the service, needing to step outside for a moment to collect herself. Tears sprang to her eyes as she sat on the steps, overwhelmed by the harshness of their words. "They're right," she thought to herself. "He didn't marry me out of pity." It was in that moment that Ethan found her, his face filled with concern. "What happened?" he asked, his voice full of worry. Martha's voice trembled as she spoke. "They said, they think you married me out of pity." Ethan's expression hardened, but there was no hesitation in his response. "Let's go back inside." He took her hand, leading her back into the church. All eyes were on them as they entered, but Ethan didn't flinch. He stepped forward, his voice strong and unshaken. "I want to make something clear to all of you," he said, his gaze sweeping over the congregation. "I married Martha Hayes because I love her, not because I pity her." There was a quiet tension in the air as he continued, his words carrying weight. "I love her strength, her kindness, her laugh, her sharp mind. Her illness doesn't diminish her worth. It just means she needs help sometimes. We all need help sometimes." He paused, his eyes hardening as he addressed the congregation directly. "Anyone who has a problem with my marriage can leave my property and stay off it." The silence that followed was deafening. It wasn't until Pastor Johnson, the kind man who had married them, spoke that the tension broke. "Ethan's right," he said, his voice steady and calm. "Marriage isn't about perfection. It's about covenant. In sickness and health, those aren't just words. They're a promise." His gaze met Martha's, and she saw the truth in his eyes. We could all learn from their example. As they left the church, Martha felt Ethan's hand in hers, steady and strong. He had defended her in front of everyone. He had given her the one thing she had never thought she could have: unconditional love. She had feared that the world would see her as a burden, but Ethan had shown her that the only opinion that mattered was his, and he loved her exactly as she was. Spring arrived in Montana with its usual unpredictable gusts of wind and moments of sunshine. The ranch seemed to come alive with the season's change, the pastures greener, the air fresher, and the promise of new growth on the horizon. Martha had come a long way since that cold morning when she had been ready to leave, convinced she was nothing but a burden. Now, in this new reality with Ethan by her side, she was learning to embrace a life she hadn't thought was possible. Even as her condition progressed, even as the tremors in her hands became more pronounced and her vision continued to fade, Martha had found a sense of peace she hadn't known before. She no longer saw herself as the woman she had been before her illness took hold. She had accepted that Although she could no longer cook as she once had or take on the physical demands of her old life, she still had value. She was learning that her worth didn't come from what she could do, but from who she was. It wasn't easy, but with each passing day, she found more joy in the simpler things. Her mornings, once spent in a frantic rush to prepare meals, now began with the quiet rhythms of bookkeeping, a skill she had discovered within herself that she never knew she had. Even on days when her hands were shaky and her vision blurred, she could still manage the accounts, overseeing the ranch's finances with a sharp mind that had always been there, even when she doubted herself. As the months passed, Martha's role on the ranch evolved, and with it, so did her sense of purpose. Ethan, proud of her accomplishments, never hesitated to praise her efforts. "You've paid for yourself 10 times over already," he'd say, and although it might have sounded like a simple compliment, it meant the world to Martha. It reminded her that she wasn't just his wife, she was a partner, and her contributions, even if they didn't look like they once had, were invaluable. Her new role brought more confidence than she had expected. She began to see how much of the ranch's success was tied to her careful attention to the finances, catching mistakes that had gone unnoticed for months. "I never could have done this without you," Ethan would say with a smile, and it made her heart swell. There were days when Martha still felt that old fear creeping in, the fear of being less than enough, of being a burden again. It was especially hard on the days when her body refused to cooperate, when the tremors in her hands were so bad that she couldn't hold a pencil, or when the world around her blurred into a haze of shapes and shadows. But she had learned to lean on Ethan, to allow him to help without shame, and over time, she began to see that being loved meant accepting the help of others, something she had never been willing to do before. The real turning point came when she discovered her love for teaching. It had started with a simple request from Hannah, Pete's wife, who had asked Martha to teach her some basic cooking techniques. At first, Martha had been reluctant. "I can't demonstrate anymore," she had said, but Hannah was persistent. "But you can still tell me what to do. Your knowledge doesn't need your hands." With that encouragement, Martha began to realize that her knowledge was valuable in ways that went beyond what she could physically do. She started instructing Hannah, then gradually took on a few more young women from the ranch who wanted to learn how to cook. It was a slow process, but Martha found that teaching brought her joy. She wasn't just passing on recipes and techniques. She was sharing a part of herself, a part of her life that had always been hers to give. She began to see herself differently, no longer just the cook or the sick woman, but as a teacher, someone whose words and experience could shape the lives of others. Soon, word spread throughout the ranch, and beyond that, Martha was offering cooking lessons, and more young women came to her for instruction. They didn't mind that she couldn't demonstrate every step. They valued her wisdom, her ability to break down complex tasks into simple instructions, her patience, and her love for what she did. Martha learned that, even without the ability to physically perform the tasks she once could, her ability to teach, to share, and to guide others was just as valuable. As the months passed, her role grew beyond teaching cooking. She began to give lessons on other skills she had learned over the years, from managing a household to dealing with finances. The women who came to her, eager to learn, had no idea what she had been through, what it had taken for her to get to this place. They only saw a woman who had something to offer, who was worth learning from. Martha's own transformation was mirrored in the changes on the ranch. What had once been a place where she felt small, where she hid behind her apron and her work, had become a place of growth for both her and the people she cared for. She was learning how to accept the love that Ethan had so freely given her. And in doing so, she was teaching others to accept their worth, regardless of what they could or couldn't do. Her love for the ranch, for the people in her life, and for herself was growing stronger each day. The work she did, even on the hardest days when her body betrayed her, was no longer a way of proving her worth. It was a way of living out the truth she had finally come to understand. Her value was not in what she could do, but in who she was. The lessons she taught were about more than just cooking or bookkeeping. They were about the power of vulnerability, the importance of accepting help, and the beauty of loving without fear. As the spring days stretched into summer, Martha felt a sense of contentment that she had never thought possible. There were still challenges, of course, days when her condition flared up and she had to rely on others more than she wanted to, but she was no longer afraid of those days. She had learned that they were just part of the journey, part of the life she was building with Ethan. And through it all, they had built something stronger than she ever thought possible. It wasn't a perfect life, but it was theirs, and that was enough. The change in Martha was also reflected in her relationship with Ethan. He no longer saw her as someone he had to take care of, but as a true partner. They worked together, side by side, through the challenges of ranch life, finding joy in the small moments, the quiet conversations at the end of the day, and the peace that came with knowing they were building something together. It wasn't always easy. There were still difficult days, days when Martha struggled with her body's limitations or when the world felt too heavy, but they faced those days together, and that made all the difference. One evening, after a long day of work, Ethan found Martha sitting on the porch, looking out over the land they had worked so hard to cultivate. He sat beside her, their hands finding each other without a word. "You've come a long way," he said softly, his voice full of pride. "I couldn't have done this without you," Martha replied, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "You've shown me what it means to be loved," she added, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Ethan smiled, his hand squeezing hers. "No, Martha," he said quietly. "You've shown me what it means to love, to really love without fear." As the sun set over the Montana plains, Martha realized that love wasn't just about receiving. It was about giving, about sharing everything you had, even the parts of you that were broken. In that moment, she understood that she had found her purpose, not in what she could do, but in who she had become. And for the first time in years, she felt truly at peace with that. A year had passed since Martha and Ethan had married, and with it came a profound transformation in both of their lives. Spring 1887 arrived, and the ranch was thriving. The once desolate and lonely place now filled with laughter, love, and purpose. Martha sat in the kitchen, a place she had once feared she might never return to in a meaningful way, but now it was the center of her new life. The sounds of clinking dishes and soft voices filled the room as Hannah, who had become a proficient cook under Martha's guidance, prepared breakfast. The smell of fresh biscuits wafted through the air, and Martha watched with pride as Hannah expertly worked the dough. Beside her, Amy, now 15 and living with them for the past 6 months, was busy learning how to make her first batch of biscuits. The young girl, once unsure of herself and timid, now radiated confidence, following Martha's instructions with care. Eleanor, ever the steady hand in the household, moved around the kitchen, setting the table, humming a tune to herself. Martha had found peace in the simple moments of life, the ones she had once taken for granted. The woman who had once felt like she had nothing left to offer, who believed her worth was tied to her usefulness, had found a new sense of belonging in these daily routines. Even though her condition had worsened, with her hands shaking more often and her sight failing her on the worst days, Martha had learned to accept herself as she was. She no longer tried to prove her worth by what she could do physically. She had shifted her focus from what she had lost to what she could give, and in doing so, she had found a new purpose. Her new role on the ranch, managing the books, had proven invaluable. Martha was able to save the ranch hundreds of dollars by finding errors in the accounts that had previously gone unnoticed. It was a job that didn't require her to be physically present in the way she had been before, and she found satisfaction in knowing that she could contribute to the ranch's success without feeling like a burden. Ethan had been nothing but supportive, proud of the work she had done and the strength she had shown. "I've always known you were more than a cook," he would say with a smile, his admiration for her growing every day. But beyond the practical tasks, beyond the bookkeeping, it was the emotional support that mattered most. Martha had learned to accept help when she needed it. And in doing so, she had discovered a love that wasn't conditional on what she could do. Ethan, too, had changed. The man who had once locked his heart away after the death of his first wife, Sarah, was now fully open to the love he had with Martha. He no longer saw their relationship as something to be guarded, something to be kept at arm's length out of fear of losing it. He had let go of his fear, and in doing so, he had created a partnership with Martha that was based on trust, vulnerability, and unconditional love. The ranch was more than just a place where they worked. It was a home, a space where they had built something together. And with Amy now living with them, it was a family. Martha had come to love the young girl as her own, and Amy had slowly begun to call her Mama in the quiet moments of the day. It was a title Martha never thought she would bear, but in the fullness of time, she realized that family didn't have to be defined by blood. It was defined by the love you gave and the love you received. As the months went by, Martha found herself teaching Amy more than just cooking. She taught her how to navigate the world with grace, how to accept help without shame, how to understand that your worth wasn't determined by what you could do for others, but by who you were at your core. In many ways, Martha saw herself in Amy, the girl who had been lost, unsure of where she fit in the world, but who now found purpose through love and acceptance. The house was quieter now, with less chaos and more contentment. But even in the quiet, there was a sense of fulfillment that Martha had never known before. The evening sun cast a soft golden light through the windows of the ranch house, and Martha found herself sitting on the porch with Ethan, their hands intertwined as they watched the world unfold before them. She had become accustomed to the simplicity of life, to the ebb and flow of the seasons, and to the understanding that every day was an opportunity to make a choice, just as she had chosen to stay, to love, and to accept love in return. But that night, something unexpected happened. As the sun set over the vast plains of Montana, Martha felt a sharp pain in her chest. At first, it was a dull ache, but it quickly grew more intense, and before she could call out to Ethan, she collapsed in his arms, gasping for breath. He carried her inside, his heart racing with fear. The panic in his eyes was mirrored in hers. But Martha, though weak, managed to whisper, "I'm okay. Just a bad moment." Ethan stayed close to her, his arms wrapped around her, his voice soothing as he held her tight. But Martha could tell that something had shifted. She had always been afraid of what was to come, afraid of losing herself completely to her illness. But in that moment, with Ethan holding her, she realized that it didn't matter what her body could or couldn't do. What mattered was the love they had built, the life they had created together. The fear she had once carried, the fear of being helpless, slowly started to fade. That night, after the pain passed and Martha had rested, she found herself lying beside Ethan, her hand on his chest. She realized that she wasn't afraid anymore, not of the illness, not of the future. She had spent so many years hiding from her vulnerability, from her need for others, but now she was ready to face whatever came next with open arms. Ethan kissed her forehead, his touch gentle but full of emotion. "You're not a burden, Martha," he whispered. "You never were." Martha smiled, her eyes closing as she drifted off to sleep in his arms. She knew that the road ahead wouldn't always be easy. There would be days when her body would betray her, when her hands would shake and her vision would fail. But she had learned that love wasn't about being perfect. It wasn't about being strong every day or having it all together. It was about showing up, about being there for each other, even when life was difficult. It was about choosing each other every day. And as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, Martha realized that she had found a new sense of peace. She no longer measured her worth by what she could do for others, by how much she could contribute physically. Her value was not tied to her ability to work, to earn, or to be useful. It was tied to who she was, the woman Ethan loved, the woman who had learned to accept love and to give love in return. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, watching the sun set over the plains, Martha looked at Ethan and smiled. "Do you remember when I tried to leave?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with gratitude. Ethan turned to her, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Best decision I ever made," he said simply. Martha's heart swelled with emotion, and she reached for his hand. "I was so sure I was a burden," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "But you never saw me that way, did you?" Ethan shook his head, his gaze steady. "No," he said, his voice full of conviction. "I never saw you as a burden. You've always been everything I needed and more." Martha leaned against him, her heart at peace for the first time in years. "And now," she asked softly, "now I know my life just changed. It didn't end. It became something different, something better in ways I never expected." Ethan smiled, his eyes filled with warmth. "Every day with you, even the hard ones, is a gift I thought I'd never have again." As they sat together, the quiet sound of the wind whispering through the trees, Martha knew that the life they had built was one of love, of acceptance, and of choosing each other. She had come full circle. The fear that had once dominated her life was now gone, replaced by something stronger, something lasting. She was no longer defined by what she could do or what she had lost. She was defined by the love she had found and the life she had chosen. And that was enough.